Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. The Norwood Paynham and St Peter's Library Service and Dylan's Bookshop would like to welcome you to the Malcolm Turnbull live stream event to launch his memoir, A Bigger Picture. We would like to acknowledge that the lands we broadcast from today is the traditional lands for the Kaurna people, and that we respect their spiritual relationship with their country. We also acknowledge the Kaurna people as the traditional custodians of the Adelaide region, and that their cultural and heritage beliefs are still as important to the living Kaurna people today. Our host for this evening is Tory Shepherd. Tory spent a number of years as the Advertiser's political editor, and today is still senior columnist with the paper. After an honours degree in anthropology and masters in communication, she was working at an art magazine when she won a cadetship. She covered police, health and state politics before going national for a few years, working for The Punch and news.com.au. Tory was eventually lured back to the Advertiser with the promise of the Canberra gig. Towards the end of the session this evening, Tory will open it up to questions. You can click on the Q&A tab to submit your questions. It is now with great pleasure that we welcome Malcolm Turnbull and our host, Tory Shepherd.
Fiona, thank you so much. That was a lovely introduction. We are obviously here to hear from Malcolm Turnbull, famously former Prime Minister, but a long history before that as a businessman, as a journalist, as a lawyer. And you've just published this tome, The Bigger Picture, which it's quite a racy read. And I'm sure even if you haven't read the book yet, you've read some media reports on the book. So welcome, private citizen Malcolm Turnbull.
Thank you very much, Tory. It's great to be here and great to be here.
You've got a good backdrop there. I'm afraid we're probably not going to see a cameo from your grandson, Jack, which is a shame.
I know. No, well, this is a curtain, obviously, which is a Utopia goods material. They're a great Australian design company that make lots of, fabrics inspired by Australian flora. So yes, that it covers up a slightly messy background. So good.
That's what my plants are for. Well, look, let's crack on. Now, I wanted to kick off talking to you about trust. One of the very first stories that you tell in this book is that your mother left you, and then your dad pretty much covered for her, almost sort of pretended that it hadn't happened, which I guess allowed you to carry on the pretense. And then there are a series of other events. For example, Jack Lang told you there's no loyalty in the Liberal Party. So can you talk me through how you maintained trust, even time and again after people betrayed you?
Well, there isn't politicians are generally not particularly trustworthy. Most of them aren't. You would have found this in your time in the press gallery. Too many politicians really are reckless about whether they're telling the truth, whether they've got the facts straight. We've got a
It was often in what they left out, I found.
Pardon?
It was often in what they left out.
Yeah, they were being economical with the truth, to quote one of my sparring partners, Sir Robert Armstrong. Look, yeah, I think it's a trust is a very scarce commodity in politics, and people are not held to account enough for the lack of it. But it's a very difficult operating environment, as I describe in the book. And I don't think any of this would come as a surprise to you, but I think a lot of people have found it quite shocking. I was basically, everyone told me not to trust everyone else. Julie and George and Christopher told me not to trust Dutton and Cormann. Dutton and Cormann told me not to trust them. Barnaby told me not to trust anyone, and everyone told me.
And you should have trusted Barnaby, it turns out.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's right. It was literally that I cannot think of any leading figure in the government that somebody wasn't telling me not to trust, honestly. And the problem is, as a Prime Minister, that you can it'd be very easy to, just turn into a sort of a ball of paranoid despair, and become paranoid about everyone. And there have been plenty of prime ministers that have done that, by the way. But the consequence then is you can't get anything done. So you just have to recognise that, some people are more reliable than others. Some people have got stronger or better characters than others. And you've got to work with them all, because unless you work with them, you can't get anything done. Some of the commentary you get on politics is just so naive, and people say, oh, it's terrible, why are you compromising? Well, that's what politics is about. Politics is all about compromise, negotiation, horse trading, whatever you want to call it. I remember at one time in the House of Representatives, someone leapt up in the Labor Party side and said, you're nothing better than a horse trader. Well, fine, it's a badge of honour, frankly. Whatever, you've got to horse trade particularly if you want to get things through the Senate and you don't have a majority. So, that's the nature of the business. What did they think Christopher was chatting to Tony Burke about behind the Speaker's chair? Sort of swapping photos of their children? No, he was horse trading, getting deals done. That's how it works.
Well, look, in a bit, I want to go back again to the beginning of the book when you're younger, but just to take you up on that horse trading, I think one of the reasons a lot of the public is quite sceptical about this is because they see the outcome of these deals, these compromises, and it seems to them like you've caved. And I think there's two sort of narratives in the book. One is the way that you try and get a compromise on same-sex marriage and on climate change particularly. But at the same time, you've got people like Matthias Cormann telling you that you can't give in to the terrorists. So now that was on...
No, but Matthias told me I must give in to the terrorists.
Sorry, must give in to the terrorists. So, and I think he actually denies that, but he's not here, so we're just going to carry on.
I've actually never seen him deny.
Okay.
I've seen him.
So
Matthias says well, the problem with Matthias, so much of what I say about Matthias, I'm just quoting things he's put in writing, right? So, he can bluster a bit, but he can't really run away from the truth.
Okay, but maybe talk to me about that difference between horse trading and compromising and just giving in to, that right-wing faction within the coalition that did seem to a small group that seems so often to determine the outcome on so many policies. Well,
it's a, compromise is, I want X, you want Y, we agree on Z, right? Is that a compromise? Yes, okay, but that's what Parliament is designed to do. Parliament is designed to bring people together so they can debate and argue about things and reach agreement. And, there's give and take. So criticising a politician for compromising is like criticising a fish for swimming. That is literally what your job is. Your job is to get things done and agreed. And the question is how much, is your compromise justifiable? Have you surrendered too much? That's the real issue. If people want politicians that don't compromise, then they should abandon parliamentary democracy and just elect a dictator every 4 years, who can do whatever he or she likes. I don't think we'd like that. In terms of the problem with the right of the Liberal Party is simply this, that they basically do not accept the premise of a political party any longer. See, the premise of a political party is that you get everybody together in a room, the members of the party, and you debate issues and thrash them around, and then you reach an agreement, you reach a consensus, and you go with the majority. So you might say, well, I've been heard, I don't think this is a great idea, but the majority want to do it, so I'll support it, That's the whole principle, right? That's the premise. Now, what's happened is that on a number of issues, the right has basically decided that they will blow the joint up if they don't get what they want. And that's what they did on energy. They've done it a couple of times on energy. and they essentially intimidate the minority to, you know, the minority intimidates the majority. I mean, there's a piece in the book where I, you know, sometime after the coup, and it's a good insight, really, where you know, I spoke to Nola Marino, who was the chief whip, and you know, Nola as the chief whip, Nola's very, very sensible, practical member from Western Australia, you know, farmer, and she made the point that she made the point that so many of the members who voted for Dutton and voted for the spill did so because they saw it was the only way to bring the insurgency and the disruption to an end was to give in to the insurgents. And that's, you know, that's essentially the tactics of terrorism. That's how terrorists operate. I mean, obviously they do it with guns and bombs, but you know, you basically say, we'll keep blowing things up until you give in to us. And that's, you know, that's the fundamental problem that we have with the right and the Liberal Party. And they have a sense of entitlement. They believe they are the real liberals, and that people like me or Christopher, that are smaller liberals and shouldn't really be in the party at all. And they intimidate the others.
But you also say that they act against their own rational self-interest, you know, that they, you know, cut off their nose to spite their face in a sense. Why is that?
Well, that's a very good question. Why is politics so irrational? I'll just read I just had a bit of trouble finding the page, but so I'll just quote from a diary entry I had on the 5th of October. I said, talking about Nola, she says, she thinks the move against me was inspired by Abbott and his group and based solely on hatred of me. She thinks they were solely focused on ensuring I couldn't get clear air and were concerned I would win, not that I would lose. She said a number of the colleagues had said to her they only voted for the spill because they felt as long as I was leader, the insurgents would not stop their destabilisation. So in a nutshell, they gave in to the terrorists. And that's really the point. So that's the, you know, therein lies that this is where a determined minority can actually intimidate a majority. So why do they do it? Look, a lot of people are irrational in politics. It's a craziness. It's power. Power turns people on to, you know, I don't know whether aphrodisiac is the right term, but there are many people who...
Kind of a hell of an image when you're thinking about the monkey pod room.
It is, it certainly is, but it is power. People, and I talk about your employer, Mr. Murdoch, in this category too. There are people, wealthy people, particularly people in the media, and I'm not speculating about this. I mean, I've known all these people for years, right, for 40 plus years. And they seek power. They want to exert power, not necessarily without any purpose other than being able to exert it. So they want politicians who will do their bidding, who are deferential, and that's the most important thing. So, you know, this is an important thing to understand, and I think it's something that I hope people can see in the book, because I've been very frank. This is politics in the raw I'm talking about. This is not a saccharine-coated, you know, formulaic, account. This is.
Oh, it's the sausage getting made.
In fact, this is how the sausages are made. This is brutal, raw politics, and a lot of people are unhappy about it. And so I can't tell you how many journalists, including senior people, distinguished journalists, have said to me, "Why were you so truthful?"
Because truth is...
So you think I should have written a book full of lies, you know? Should have written a book full of lies. Maybe that's what they wanted. Crazy.
Well, look, we are going to get back to your earlier life, but just while we're on this,
we can get back to the transaction
track, well, just one more while we're because there's just something I want to burrow into there. So you're talking about, I guess, that transactional nature of things that happen in Canberra. So a politician will do this, get favourable coverage, a journalist will do something, you know, a puff piece on a minister to get closer contact or to get leaks out of cabinet, however it was. Now, one of the biggest culprits that you name in your book is the current Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, in terms of the way that he would feed information in order to get favourable coverage.
Yeah. Well, that's true. Well, I mean, you were there in the gallery. You know, does any of this come as a shocking surprise to you? A revelation?
No, but we've got this great big audience out there who might like to see a bit more of that sausage meat.
Yeah. Well, no, but I mean, this was look. I worked effectively and constructively with Scott while I was PM and he was Treasurer, but the one problem I had with him, and it was a big one, was that he would front run economic policy in the media. Matthias and I could not understand why he did it. We thought it was completely counterproductive. Came close to despairing about it, you know, and he was, so it was as though he wanted to think aloud, and it undermined the government's economic agenda because it made us look as though we were undecided and we were all over the place. Whereas in fact, we were doing no more than what any responsible government should do, which is consider a lot of options. But you don't want to be doing that. You don't want the sausage making to be done in the full glare of publicity. But it's an interesting, I mean, I think readers will find it interesting. It is very raw, it's very real. And this did us a huge amount of damage. It really did. And particularly in the lead up to the 2016 election. And I couldn't work out why he was doing it. By 2018, he'd stopped. I think I'd finally persuaded him it wasn't a good idea. And that's one of the reasons the 2018 budget was such a good budget, because we kept it tight, we worked out what we wanted to do, and then we announced it.
And you would consider him trustworthy now? Should the public trust him?
Well, up to a point. I mean, you know, you can look. It depends what you mean by trust. I mean, I think. I mean, some politicians are more fastidious than others about getting the facts straight, right? So I won't comment on Scott on this point, but just for my own part, I was always anxious and apprehensive that I was getting a fact wrong, you know, and it might be something quite mundane, it might be a statistic. So, you know, accuracy mattered. So that's one of the reasons I was mortified, and, you know, I'll sort of contributed to my being very depressed in 2010. I was mortified by the fact that I'd made a false allegation against Kevin Rudd in 2009. You know, and a lot of my parliamentary colleagues were surprised I was so cut up about it. But, you know, I really do. I don't mind making very strong criticism of people, and there's plenty of that in this book. And well, criticism. I mean, there are facts described which are unedifying, but that's what happened. You know, I always say if people feel they've been represented in a bad light, they perhaps should have behaved better at the time. But what I don't like doing is getting the facts wrong. And I don't think that there's a high enough premium on that. And I think the media let politicians get away with being inaccurate far too readily. I mean, a good example is the Medi scare in 2016, you know, which you knew we all know was this huge lie. You know, the coalition is going to sell Medicare. Malcolm Turnbull's going to sell Medicare.
Well, I think a lot of the media did actually call that out at various points.
Yeah, they did. They did. Some of them did. That's true. But the overall consensus was that Shorten had been very clever. And so this is the problem with looking at politics as a game. So, you know, you say, so-and-so, you know, was offside, you know, punched the other guy, the ref didn't see it, he got away with it, you know, sidestepped and scored. Hooray, how clever. Well, politics is more important than football, and there is a whole moral, ethical component in it. And, you know, winning elections by lying to people is not clever, it's really bad. and it undermines our democracy.
And yet somehow it keeps working. Can we talk a bit? I know you've spoken a bit about your depression and about having suicidal thoughts, and I should just inject here that if anyone out there is having issues, they should visit lifeline.org.au or call them on 131114. So I know you've gone into that quite a bit, and the background was the Godwin-Gretsch affair, where a public servant, for whatever reason, duped you into thinking that Kevin Rudd had done something wrong. But there's also a broader issue there, isn't there? I mean, you mentioned Mal Washer in your book as well, and I remember Mal Washer, saying he was treating a third of the people in Canberra for depression or anxiety. So what is it about that place? Is it the people? Is it the place? Is there anything we can do about these, horrifying levels of mental illness by the people?
Yeah, I think Parliament House is a very unhealthy place, right? So there are a couple of things about it that you probably can't do a lot about, and there are actually most of the things that are wrong with it you can't do much about. I mean, you've got to have your parliament somewhere. Australia's a big country, so you have it in one place. It happens to be in Canberra.
Never on Zoom?
We'll come back to that perhaps. But it basically means that assuming everyone's meant to turn up, that a lot of people are going to be away from home for a long time. It's a weird environment because Canberra isn't really a city in a conventional sense. I mean, instead of, when you walk out of the parliament, you're nowhere. You're just surrounded by a sort of spaghetti junction of freeways and overpasses. So you're stuck in that building. You get there early in the morning, you leave late at night. The building itself is vast. It's actually really badly designed. I mean, but we're going to be stuck with it for the next 300 years. So that's it. But, if you think about what a parliament should be, it should be designed to get people to meet and have serendipitous encounters, to bump into each other and have a chat and all that stuff. As you know, the place is so vast. The journalists are banished to one end of the building, the MHRs, the MPs are down one end, the senators are down the other, the ministers are down the other. It's designed to actually make people not meet. I mean, Lucy, whose great interest is in architecture and planning and so forth, her theory is that when they designed the new parliament in the 70s, people were so fed up with the crowded old parliament house that they
where the journos could eavesdrop on the politicians.
They wanted something that was absolutely vast and they could be, miles away from each other, and they've achieved that, but at a very heavy price. Also, add to that, politics is very competitive. It can be very personal. The journalists want to get scalps. Politicians want to get scalps. People feel that their advancement can only occur at the expense of others. So, as a highly competitive business. So, all in all, it's a pretty high stress environment. But I think
a lot of alcohol.
Yeah, a lot of alcohol. I think the building is the building's design plays a big part in it. I think it's a case of, rather than form following function, I think form frustrates function with Parliament House.
Well, even after years there, I was always getting lost. And one of the lovely security guards, who quite often had to gently herd me back to the press gallery, he told me once he thought it was maybe so that if a terrorist or an assassin got into the building, they had no idea where to find anyone because it's impossible.
Well, I mean, to give you an idea of how vast, your listeners, how vast it is. So in 2006, I was Howard's parliamentary secretary, right? That is the first step on the ministerial ladder, first rung on the ladder. And my office was at the northern end of the top floor of the House of Representatives wing. So that is as far away from the Prime Minister's office as you could get and still be in the building. And so when I had to trot along and report to my boss, I would, walk those corridors. And in a sitting week, sometimes I would pass nobody, pass one or two people. And the building had, 3,000 people in there on a sitting week. And they're all tucked away in their offices, all isolated. So it's really bad design. But as I say, we will be stuck with it for the next just several centuries.
Indeed. All right, back to earlier in the book.
Yes.
Now, you were talking about facts, right? And I'm not sure if you got this right. So you said that when you're in the surf club and everyone's getting naked in the change rooms, everyone looks the same with their gear off. I'm not sure that's technically correct.
That is,
but,
you're quite right.
But I did
right.
admire the sentiment of egalitarianism behind it. And that's a bit of a thread with your relationship with Bruce, I think, where you're sort of, you know, you're living in not far from where you are now, actually. You know, a little flat, not a lot of money, and hanging around with sort of, you know, everyone from sort of feisty union officials to cleaners and whatever else. So how then does it feel coming out of that and being so explicitly aware of the importance of egalitarianism to then be hit with Mr. Harbourside Mansion? Did you take that personally?
Not really. I mean, that was just a sledge from Credlin. You know, I always thought it was amusing that the media that used to go on and on about my you know, allegedly vast wealth were those belonging to the Murdochs, whose wealth would exceed mine by several hundred times, I would think. So, look, you know, it's there it is. I mean, you know, one thing I've always recognised, and you've probably heard me talk about this before, is that contrary to quite a few wealthy people, I've never believed that I'm entitled or that I deserved to be financially successful. I mean, yes, hard work is important, can be important, but there are plenty of people that have worked much harder than me and haven't made any money. You know, plenty of taxi drivers have worked much longer hours than I have. So there's a lot of good fortune, and that's why Lucy and I have always been generous. We've always been philanthropic. We've always taken the view that, you know, your good fortune is very much the result of, you know, of luck, of providence, whatever you want to call it. I mean, even down to, you know, the brains you inherit from your parents. I mean, that's no more deserved than, you know, someone's inheriting a lot of money from wealthy parents. So it's you know, it's very important to keep all that stuff in perspective, I think. You know, I've noticed over the years, and I've dealt with a lot of very wealthy people, and a lot of them, the more colourful ones, are in the book. So many of them feel that their wealth entitles them to privileges that are not available to others. And, you know, I've never, ever subscribed to that.
And while we're talking about wealth, Australia is in this fascinating situation, obviously. At the moment, we've got, you know, the tragic, terrifying coronavirus, but we're now sort of talking about what we're going to look like when we come out of this period. And there are a couple of narratives emerging, the sort of, you know, snap back, get back to how things were before, or is this a good chance to reset, for example? You know, will the government be able to reduce Newstart back to what it was? Would you hope for a different way of doing things out of this?
Well, I think the chances of being able to reduce Newstart back to where it was are very low. I mean, that would be, you know, they might.
Well, they've admitted it's not enough, right?
Yeah, I mean, it was like there was a very powerful argument that it was inadequate to begin with. I think it's all of those things will be that the snapback is probably too idealistic or a bit unrealistic. I think there's going to be a lot of changes. Look, we've got to recognise we are looking at a global recession, maybe depression as a result of this. We've got to look at the reality that there are millions of people that have lost their jobs, and firms will often be cautious and reluctant to rehire all of the people that they lost. So we've got to, you know, the government's going to have to be very focused on maintaining economic growth. It's got to be very careful about falling for populist arguments about protectionism, for example, that might sound good in the tabloids, but would result in, you know, handbrake on the economy. We've got to remember our vested interest is in free trade and open markets. We can't kid ourselves about that. I think, Tory, there's going to be trends that this will accelerate. So, doing what we're doing here, and we've all been doing lots of Zooming and Skyping and Teamsing and, WebExing and all these things. And I think that will permanently change the way people work. So, I think a lot of businesses will say, do I really need all that space? Do I really need all that office space? Will we work in a different way? You look at e-commerce, it's been, obviously we've all been shopping and doing stuff online much more than ever. That's a trend that will be accelerated. But then you've got to ask yourself, what about businesses and trends that are going to be reversed? I mean, will travel bounce back to where it was? I don't think so. Not for a long time. Business travel, I think there will be a break on that because of people have realised how much they can do online. You also got to ask yourself a bit about cities and design. We've thought for a long time that, and there's been a trend for cities to become denser because people want to live closer to each other because there's greater amenity. Is density, we used to see as the solution, not the problem. Is it now going to become a problem and that people will want to spread out more? And of course, and have the ability to do so effectively because of technologies like this. So it's there's a lot of big changes around, but I think if you get back to, say, South Australia in particular, it underlines the importance of the priority that I put on advanced manufacturing in South Australia, on the defence industry, on the fact that we're going to build our future Navy almost entirely in South Australia, and that I know that a lot of people say that was to save Christopher Pyne's seat. Well, Christopher Pyne, incredibly charismatic though he is not so charismatic as to warrant that level of expenditure.
It's a lot of billions.
But the fact that we've got to have a focus on having the most advanced technology we can in Australia in every field, and of course with defence, you really are at the cutting edge. So we should be building our defence capabilities in Australia, and in so doing, obviously develop the skills to do so many other things as well. So I think it's going to be a more competitive world, and obviously one, therefore, that the pressure is going to be on us to be, more productive and more innovative, dare I say. So I think you're well positioned in South Australia, if I may say so, to have an optimistic note. I think you've got a lot of things going for you. You've got that big defence industry commitment. You've got a wonderful, very livable city. And you've got a state premier in Stephen Marshall, who has got exactly the right temperament for the times. He's an optimist. He's a businessman. He's a glass half full person rather than being a whinging, whining character, and that's really important. So I think you may well find 5 years from now that people will feel that they're glad they're in Adelaide and South Australia rather than somewhere else.
And you forgot to mention the Space Agency. Yeah,
well, that's right. Another initiative of the Turnbull government that, according to...
I did not mean to open the way for you to...
No, but it is, but it's true. But I mean, I set up the Space Agency. There was quite a bit of official scepticism about that. But you have some great space sector businesses, new businesses in South Australia, including one I invested in just recently, Myriota, small satellite company. Yeah.
Now, when we're talking about the post-coronavirus world, I mean, we're seeing pictures of blue skies above Beijing. People travelling less. All this. Are you optimistic that in this new world, emissions will go down? People will realise that all the travel isn't so necessary. How do you think it'll go in a policy sense? You know, we've had these climate wars for more than a decade now. How do you think we can get to a place where we're actually working towards those Paris targets in a real way?
Well, I mean, look, the obstacles in Australia and in the United States too, by the way, are entirely political. I mean, we're now in a position where we know, and you know very well in South Australia, that if you plan it right, you can have very low emission or zero emission energy and lower prices, right? But you've got to plan it. You know, that's why I always used to say we need engineering and economics, not ideology and idiocy. And, you know, we've had too much of the ideology and idiocy, both from the left and the right, frankly. But so, and, you know, and that's why, you know, schemes like Snowy Hydro 2.0 or the smaller pumped hydro projects in South Australia are so important, because they make the wind and the solar, they make the renewables reliable, okay? Now, in terms of the politics, honestly, I cannot understand why there is so much political opposition to taking action on climate change. I mean, the reality of the physics of global warming is exactly the same as the reality of the biology of the COVID-19 virus, right? I mean, that is what we are dealing with is here with the virus is a situation where there were people in politics and in the media who were saying it's all a hoax, or it's not serious, or it's just it's no more than the flu. You know, that was about 6 weeks ago. Obviously, they're not saying that now.
Oh, some people still.
Well, yeah, I mean, you've got President Bolsonaro in Brazil is saying that, and as the coffins pile up, I mean, staggering stuff. But at some point, politics has to yield to physics. I mean, how many more million hectares of our country do we want to burn in, one bushfire season being worse than the one before we actually wake up and say, hey, this is real. You cannot keep on increasing the temperature of the planet without there being some pretty adverse consequences. So that's the challenge. When will the politics change? That's the issue here, and it's the issue in America, where frankly, it is just the whole issue has just been poisoned by political division. I mean, Greta Thunberg, I thought nailed it when she said, I go to America and people start talking about whether they believe in climate change. In Europe, no one asked whether you believe in it, it's a fact. And truthfully, saying you believe or don't believe in climate change is saying you believe or don't believe in gravity. Well, if you don't believe in gravity, go and jump off a skyscraper, see if your views about gravity evolve on the way down.
So look, we're about to throw to questions. So I think everybody should see there's a little Q&A box there where you can put your questions through. I just had one more quick one for you, Malcolm. When you're talking about the South China Sea, you voiced the concern that maybe the United States, our big powerful ally, is a paper tiger, that maybe, I'm reading into that they may not be able to be trusted to come to our aid if we needed their help. And obviously China has been in the news of late. We've had some pretty strident words coming from both sides. How do you see that, very quickly, 140 words or less, how do you see that playing out?
Well, you've raised a couple of big complex issues there, and which I deal with a lot at some length in the book. But I just say this, there is no point giving in to bullies, right? Sucking up to bullies, whether they are imperial powers or billionaires, is that there is no value in that. You've got to stand your ground, you've got to be consistent, and stand up for your own interests. Argue your case as persuasively as you can. There's no point being rude. But, the Chinese ambassador who was making all the threats about trade sanctions, effectively, was what he was talking about, really. He made all those threats against me and my government in 2018. It didn't dissuade me from, ensuring that the foreign interference legislation was passed. So, there's only one thing to do with bullies, and that's stare them down.
That was quite concise. Thank you, Mr. Turnbull. All right, so I'm going to have a look at these questions now. This is an interesting one from Christine Amory. She asked, how much do you consider your drive, ambition and success stems from your mother not being present during your childhood?
I'm not great, Christine, on sort of self-psychoanalysis.
You haven't been doing...
I don't. I mean, but it's a fair question. It probably is a bit of that. Maybe I was anxious, always been anxious to prove myself, but I was always anxious to please my parents as a kid. I think most kids are. Maybe that was enhanced by my mother not being around.
We seem to have come out of it with a fairly large amount of resilience. You took a crappy boarding school from the sounds of it. Your mother left, you've got on all right.
Yeah, I've survived.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, Theo wants to know, because you came to politics quite late, was it 50, wasn't it?
50, yep, that's right.
So Theo wants to know, if you've been pre-selected earlier in your career, such as in the early 80s, do you think you would have become PM?
Well, I nearly was pre-select. I nearly was pre-select. Well, I ran in a Liberal pre-selection for Wentworth in 1981 as a complete speculator. Lucy and I hadn't been long back from England, and I ran on the basis, I'd just gone to the bar, I was a barrister, and I ran on the basis that I thought there'd probably be some solicitors on the pre-selection panel, and if I impressed them, they might send me some work. So it was literally that basic. And to everyone's surprise, including mine, and to Lucy's horror, I came very close to winning it. So yeah, I nearly could have got into Parliament in 1981. Would I have become Prime Minister? Probably not. Probably not.
Why do you suspect that? Because it's
I don't know. Well, look, who knows? I mean, this is speculation, utterly worthless speculation. But I think, I would have been, I would have had no real life's experience beyond a few years as a journalist and a university student.
Now, cheeky one here from Mark Keane. He says, given you, quote marks, virtually invented the internet in Australia, end quote, which I don't think is something you ever claimed, but a claim thrown at you. But
I assumed it was a joke. But,
yeah. The point of the question is, how do you feel the NBN is going and the future of our infrastructure?
Okay.
Let's not do all the infrastructure.
The NBN is almost built. It's about 95+% built. It's holding up very well, I think. The controversial issue has always been that when we took over it in 2013, instead of continuing with Rudd's plan to have fibre to the premises for the fixed line footprint, which is 93% or so of the population, to use a mix of technologies. In other words, and which is purely designed to get people onto high-speed broadband as quickly and as cheaply as possible. That decision, I think, has been vindicated by this pandemic, because had we not done that, anywhere between half and 40% of the population would still be on ADSL, right? Would not have enough bandwidth in almost all cases to do this Zoom webinar. So I think the NBN was poorly conceived by Rudd. It was and again, there's a chapter about that. There was a very obvious and better way to go about it, which is the way the New Zealanders did. I used to say at the time that as comms minister, I was like the person who's driving an island and gets lost, and goes into the pub and says, "Can you give me directions to Dublin?" And the barman says, "If I were you, I wouldn't be starting from here." So, I had to play the hand of cards I was dealt. So I think the team at NBN, the new team, have done a phenomenal job. But it's not, people. There was one thing I remember Tony Windsor used to say: "Do it once, do it right, do it with fibre." It was just so naive, I think his heart was in the right place. But in telecoms, you don't do anything once. These technologies are constantly being upgraded and improved. I mean, the electronics, are replaced well, none of it will be around, and none of the electronics will be around in a decade, and much of it will be replaced well before that. So the point is that what we were able to do is we got almost everybody now connected to high-speed broadband. There is, no one in Australia, unless they've got some specific site-specific problem, should have less than 25 megs. Over 90% of the population have got 50 megs or better. And that's, that will improve over time. That will increase over time as technologies get better. But I would just say, I think the NBN's going through a very big test at the moment. I think it's performing well. And I think
you better hope you don't cut out right now. That would be embarrassing.
Yeah, that's true. It would be. I mean, I had, but the interesting thing is when you talk about, it's an important thing to remember about what does the NBN do? The NBN provides the connectivity between your boundary, your house, and an exchange. They call it a point of interconnection. So everything that happens in your house, your wiring, your computer. I had an old computer on this desk that, gave up the ghost of last week. That had nothing to do with the NBN. Equally, from the point of interconnection, the exchange back into the internet is the responsibility of your telco. So, there's a lot of pieces in that connection between your computer or your iPhone sitting here and the server that you're connecting to, whether it's Netflix or Apple or whatever. A lot of bits of interconnection, and the NBN's only part of it. But I think it's done well. There are parts of the network that are going to have to be improved, particularly in the fixed line footprint. I don't know how many people here are on fixed line, but in the sort of the peri-urban areas, you've got NBN being provided on a wireless basis. So it's essentially the same technology as mobile, except it's a dedicated bandwidth for a particular number of households. And that's under a lot of pressure with the increased demand. Satellite has been good, but satellite has inherent limitations of latency. It takes a while for the signal to get from, your place up to the bird in the sky and down to the ground station and back again.
Now, Mr. Turnbull, thank you very much for that. And I think Kevin
As usual, I've talked too long. You should never ask me a question about, you know what that great South Australian Julie Bishop
book that
used
you
to say
can be
about
quite
the NBN?
wordy.
Yeah, can I tell you?
That.
I've really got to tell you a Julie story. So Julie, this is in the book too. Julie once said to me after listening to me talking about the NBN once, she's very funny. She said, Malcolm, when people hear you talk about the NBN, they have two thoughts. The first one is, gosh, I'm glad I'm not the communications minister. And the other one is, I hope he knows what he's talking about, because I have no idea what he's talking about.
Well, thank you. And you do concede in the book that you can be occasionally wordy, particularly when it comes to
I know. It was Kim Beazley used to say he was prolix.
I love that word.
Yeah.
Now, you probably won't be prolix about this next one, but I'm going to put it to you anyway. This one's from Morris.
Yeah.
And he says, some who have read the book have said you've been very timid about commenting on the dalliances of those around you. What do you really think about the enclave of the Liberal Party? And I just want to interject a couple of things there. One is, you do mention in the book that there were several ministers who were perhaps having dalliances around Canberra, but you do have quite a crack at George Christensen.
I'm not one for, I don't believe in, disclosing other people's, private lives. Okay. So the only sort of private life, I guess, that gets any discussion in the book is Barnaby Joyce's circumstances, which of course were anything but private, and resulted in a change to the ministerial standards. So that was not a private situation. As far as Christensen was concerned, I mean, Christensen, and was spending, 100 days a year when he was supposed to be the member for Mackay.
You want to say member for Manila, don't you?
Yeah, well, that's right. He was, but his electorate's in Mackay. It's in North Queensland. It's the electorate's called Dawson, but that's basically the city of Mackay. And he was spending 100 days a year mostly in the Philippines, some parts of it in Thailand, staying in sleazy parts of Manila, spending a lot of money in nightclubs and bars and so forth. And this is a guy who was wandering around lecturing people on marriage, denouncing marriage equality, claiming to be a great Christian. He had a big statue of the Virgin Mary in his office, a tattoo of the Virgin on his shoulder. I mean, and leaving all that aside, leaving all the religious, political stuff aside, had a full-time job on good money. But politicians say they're not paid enough, but the backbenchers are paid more than twice average full-time earnings, and was spending nearly a third of the year out of the country. It was bizarre. And so this was a guy that was as you recall, was and this is again a matter of public record, was conspiring with Credlin and Andrew Bolt to bring down my government at the end of 2017.
By crossing the floor, indeed.
Yeah, that's right. And they outed him. They outed him. Bolt and Credlin outed him when he lost his nerve and didn't go through with it. Bizarre.
Well, that's enough on the dalliances. Now we've got about 2 minutes left, but I think this is a really good question to end on. And Ian McCall asks, what advice would you give to someone considering a career in politics?
Think about it very carefully. I think it's there's nothing, there are a few things more important than the government of Australia and the management of, our parliament, and it's determining so much of our future. So I always encourage people to get involved and to run. So that's good. So I would say I'd encourage you to do it. But okay, I'll give you a couple of practical things. Firstly, it's a huge strain on relationships. Being a member of parliament is very hard on people, on families, particularly on couples with young children. So you've really got to make sure that your partner, assuming you do have a partner, you're married, is absolutely up for it. It's not a case of where people used to say you get two for the price of one, but don't imagine it's not like getting a job at the bank, right? It's a very, very different type of job. The pressures are enormous. You're away from home an enormous amount, and you've got to think very carefully about all of that. I think in terms of where do you start? You could be like Beck Sharkey and run as an independent, although Beck started off as a Liberal, of course. But you could, I think what you've really got to do is, for most cases, is get involved with one of the major parties. Obviously I encourage people to join the Liberal Party, but I would rather someone was active in the Labor Party than not active in politics at all. One of the problems we've got in politics is that regular people, normal people, and I use that term advisedly, are not joining political parties in the way they used to. Let me give you an example. In '73, when I was 19, I joined the Liberal Party in Wentworth, where I lived all my life. And the membership was a really good cross-section of the community. There were local bank managers, and there were directors of banks. There were Queen's Counsel, and there were local solicitors. There were GPs and Macquarie Street surgeons. You had it was the sort of the middle class, professional class, well represented in the Liberal Party. The Liberal Party branches aren't like that anymore. my generation, I'm a baby boomer, and possibly also yours, Tory, don't join political parties or anything much the way my parents' generation did. And so that's one of the reasons why you get the political parties, their branches, being dominated by people who have views that are not representative of the electorate whose support they're seeking to attract.
Which probably brings us neatly back to that issue of trust and people not trusting politics anymore. Yeah. Now, thank you so much. You've been very generous with your time. Thank you, everybody, for coming along. Thanks for coming to my place, and I'm glad you got to visit Point Piper over here. Thank you so much to Heidi Grant, the publishers, and also, of course, to Dylan's bookstore, which is a fabulous bookstore, and anyone in Adelaide should go and visit it. It is open, and of course, the Norwood Paynham and St Peter's Library. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night, and maybe I'll see you on the other side of the coronavirus.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Tory.
Thanks, Malcolm.